Okay, so we're going to pick up with Parmenides today. We talked about Heraclitus, the Greek who believed the underlying substance of all things is fire. So now we have Thales with water, Anaximenes with air, Heraclitus with fire. You kind of see where we're going with this, with the ancient Greek elements. The next guy, however, who was Heraclitus' disciple, his name is Parmenides. And Parmenides really switched things up. He said, not only can you not step in the same river twice, you cannot step in the same river once, because the underlying substance of all things is oneness. In other words, he's saying, there is only one thing. And if there is only one thing, there is only one time, there is only one place, which means there's no place to go, because you're already there. That's why you can't step into the river, because the river is an illusion. You are an illusion. There is only one thing. And when we think we see different objects or things in the world, we get confused in our mind. And this is our next major shift in philosophy. Parmenides is a rationalist, and he is claiming we have to use reason to correct our sense perception. All the folks so far have been empiricist, and that's a $20 word to mean we gain knowledge through sense perception, through our eyes, through our nostrils, through our ears, through touch. That is how we taste. That's how we get to know the world. But the rationalists are saying, no, your senses can deceive you. That's why you have to use reason to critique and adjust your senses. And Parmenides said, based on reason, there can only be one thing. Okay? Now, that's not the way the world appears, but intellectually, we have to understand the truth of it. And he had a lot of examples to do that. Let me see if I can do one for you real quickly. So, Parmenides had a buddy called Zeno. And Zeno was a mathematician. And he used mathematical paradoxes to help support Parmenides' ideas. And so here's one of the examples. If we take something, an object like this, and we divide it in half, and then in half again, theoretically, how many times can I keep dividing this object?
Infinitely.
An infinite amount of time.
Infinite.
But do you see the problem? If I can divide this piece of paper an infinite amount of times, it means this paper is infinitely large, which would mean the entire cosmos would be filled with that piece of paper. Therefore, division is not possible. Okay, let me explain this to you in another way. I know you're looking at me on a computer screen, and I can't physically go through my screen into your room and bonk you on the head or whatever. But imagine coming up to the screen from where you are now. Well, if I could teleport through walking through my screen, first I would have to get to the halfway point between me and the screen. But in order to get to that halfway point, I'd have to get to the halfway point between me and the halfway point. But in order to get to the halfway point between the half point, I'd have to get to this point, this point, this point. Theoretically, there's an infinite amount of points between me and you. Therefore, I can never reach you because you're infinitely far away. Movement is not possible. Movement is an illusion. He's using an argument technique in philosophy called argumentum ad absurdum. And it's where you take the perspective of your opponent to its logical conclusion to show them how nonsensical it is, and thereby making your proposition seem correct. Are you okay, Carlos? You're grabbing your head funny.
I'm trying to like dissect that. That's crazy. So then, I don't know. That's crazy.
It actually took people, I think, into the 18th century to figure a mathematical solution to Zeno's paradoxes. Now, we do have mathematical solutions today, but the ancient Greeks did not. And so Zeno was just messing with people's heads like crazy. For example, it's why if I shoot an arrow at a target, why the arrow can never hit the target. Because there's an infinite amount of space between the arrow and the target. Think about, I didn't have geometry until like the 7th grade, and I still remember that class because I was so traumatized. The teacher's up there doing timelines on the board, and he starts simple, and I wish I had a whiteboard, but I'll just do it virtually. I'll draw in the air for you. So he starts with a point on the board. By the way, you can't draw a point on the board. Why is that?
You can never get your marker to the board because there's infinite space.
No, like, why can't you draw a point on a whiteboard? Does anyone know how to define a point in geometry?
Mm-mm.
A point has location,
Isn't
but
it point 0, 0?
a point
Like
has
in the middle?
a point has location, but it does not have any height, width, or depth.
I haven't taken geometry in years.
There's no
so-
dimensionality to a point. It's simply a marker for location. So if you put a dot on the board to represent a point, that dot has dimensionality. Even though it's not a lot of dimensionality, it's a symbol for a point. You can't actually write a point. Is that tracking with me? But now's where it gets disturbing, right? Because we use points to make all the other geometric shapes. So a line is the shortest distance between 2 points. But the points have no dimensionality, and a line is made up of all the points in between the 2 points on the outside. And then we use lines to make planes, right? Now we don't just have length, we have length and depth. And then to make, or height. And then a cube is length, height, depth, our 3-dimensional world. But it's all being made by something that has no dimensionality. So that's when I became a math atheist or agnostic in the 7th grade, when I was like, good Lord, you're building this whole construct off of something that doesn't even exist or have dimensionality. But he used that to make a timeline. And so he puts a point on the board, he labels it 0, and then he draws a line with an arrow on the end to symbolize that line is going infinitely in that direction. And then he makes dashes. He goes 1, 2, 3, 4, to an infinite amount of numbers. And then he drew a line going the other way with an arrow on it. And he said, you can go -1, -2, -3, infinitely. It's the next thing is what broke my mind as a 7th grader. He went in between 0 and 1 on the timeline, and he said, there is also an infinite amount of numbers between 0 and 1. And my poor little prefrontal lobe attachment 7th grade mind could not handle it. And I stayed after class and argued with him for an hour that there cannot be an infinite amount of numbers. But he showed me half, quarter, eighth, 16th, 32nd, 64th, and as much as you can keep going, you can have an infinite amount of numbers between 0 and 1. Infinity can be between the fingers on your hand. There's an infinite amount of space. And this is what Zeno was using to mess with the Greeks and to support Parmenides' thesis that all is one. And it doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it the
So
world.
Zeno himself wasn't Greek.
Who?
Zeno himself wasn't Greek.
No, he was a Greek too.
Okay.
I believe.
So why do you want to mess with them?
Maybe it's a philosophical thing. That's the greatest joy of my life, is to mess with people's minds. And so he was using
He was
mathematics
Greek. Why would he want to mess with his peers?
because he
That'd
was
be like me
trying
going
to
to
show them, Christina,
In
that
high school, back when I was in high school, and
he
flaring up a storm.
he was trying to show these Greek mathematicians, like the Pythagoreans, that if we take your mathematical reasoning to its logical conclusions, it leads to madness and nonsense. So we have to get beyond observations of the physical world, and we need to trust our reason. And what our reason can tell us is there is only one thing. When it appears there's two things, that's an illusion. The reality, there's only one thing, one time, one place. And this is really the premise of most Eastern philosophy and religion. So if you've studied Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, any sort of pantheism, pan means all and theism means God. So literally all is God. There is only one thing. But if you don't believe in a God, you could simply believe all is matter, or all is this underlying thing that cannot be named, like back to Anaximander. And so Parmenides is pushing forth this idea of monism. One thing exists, you can call it whatever you want, God or nature, it doesn't matter. But this is where I believe he differs from like the Hindus and Buddhists. He was a monistic materialist. The pantheists believe the one substance is spirit. The materialist believes it's matter. And so he's a monistic materialist who he believes only one thing exists, but that one thing is physical material reality. But there's no movement, there's no change in time. All of that is the illusion. The reality is that oneness. And let me wrap it up this way by saying, one more example. He used the example of why the hare can never beat the tortoise. Because if you have the tortoise and the hare starting at the same starting point, and the hare gives the tortoise a head start, right? So the tortoise is starting here, the hare's back here. No matter how quick the tortoise is, it's going to take him some amount of time from get to point A to point B where the tortoise is starting. In that amount of time, the tortoise will have moved. Even if it's not very far, he will have moved. Now the rabbit has to catch up to where the tortoise is now, but that is going to take amount of time. In that amount of time, the tortoise will have moved again. So no matter how fast the hare is, time will have elapsed and he will never catch the tortoise. Once again, there are solutions to that dilemma today, but not in the time of Parmenides. And so he just fried the ancient mathematicians' minds. Let me tell you the solution to the paper one while I'm at it. See, being a non-mathematician, I simply thought infinity equals infinity. But my math friend said, "Oh, Fred, oh, you poor little simpleton, there's different types of infinity." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "There's limited infinity and then there's infinite infinity." And I was like, good Lord, what's limited infinity? And he said, go back to your timeline example. If you take this piece of paper, it's simply one directional timeline. It's not the entire cosmos. It's not like arrows going both. So even though I can infinitely divide this theoretically into an infinite amount of pieces, if I put all those infinite pieces back together, it will never be bigger than this original piece of paper. Because I'm only making it smaller going one way. I'm not doubling the size going the other way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the solution to that dilemma. Just because I can infinitely divide it does not mean it's infinitely large. Okay, it will never get bigger than all the pieces put back together will still only be the size of the original piece of paper. So that's that solution. Anyways, I really like Parmenides. I think it's super interesting way to think about things, and I actually think, at least logically, he's making more sense than the other Greeks. Even though that's not normally how we think in the West, it's just such solid arguments for there only being one thing, one time, and one place. And even though I don't necessarily agree with his materialism, I would think that pantheists have more tuned into this idea that oneness is spiritual and the physical world is illusion. Now, coming from a theist perspective, I personally believe in both a spiritual and a physical material world. But the spiritual world, I would say quite comfortably, God is one and nothing exists outside of God. God is the totality of reality, and all being is subsumed within the being of God. No, I'm not saying like a pantheist or Hindu that I'm God or all things are God, but I'm saying nothing exists outside of or apart from God. That's Orthodox Christianity. There is a consistency where everything is the same, but there is also a flux where things appear to change. And so for me personally, I actually see Heraclitus and Parmenides as two sides of the same coin. One is focused on the oneness and constancy, and the other is talking about the change. But both believe in a holistic consistency, like Heraclitus's cosmic egg, and from whence everything came and will return to again. It's all still one thing. Or Parmenides seeing everything permanent and not moving, not changing, and the change we do perceive as being illusion. I think they're just focused on two sides of the same issue. There is a world of consistency that appears to be in flux. And this is kind of rounds out the monistic materialist philosophers. So Thales, we have water, Anaximenes, air, Heraclitus, fire. We don't have a Greek that's earth that I'm aware of, or maybe those lightings are lost. But the next guy we're going to start with on Thursday is Empedocles. And Empedocles is thinking, how can all these brilliant people that came before me keep disagreeing with each other? Is it possible that they're all correct, or at least partially correct? And so we are going to get to the pluralist in next class, where they don't just think there's one underlying substance for reality, but for the Greeks and Empedocles, it's earth, air, fire, and water. And when they're combined in different proportions, they create different things, from humans to the great trees. Oh, Christina used the example of air earlier, and here's one more thing that you might find interesting. Anaximenes said everything comes from air, either rarefaction or condensation. I just learned this a couple years ago. When you look at trees and most plants are primarily made of air. That just blows my mind. And what is happening in the photosynthesis process is these plants are able to literally take CO2 molecules from the air. They're stripped the molecule. They keep one carbon atom and one oxygen atom, and they release an oxygen atom into the air. And so when we talk about trees producing air, what they're actually doing is scouring the atmosphere of CO2. They're stripping that molecule, keeping one carbon, one oxygen, and releasing an oxygen atom into the air. So that's them making air. But the tree itself is actually using that carbon. Trees are built basically of carbon fiber they have taken from the air to build those enormous, magnificent structures. And when you see the weight and the loads that those beings can carry, it's absolutely stunning. And it's kind of changed my perception about forest fires too. I mean, so much of California is burning right now, but it is part of that cycle of life. Literally, a fire is returning the wood to the air from which it came. And then other trees will be able to take that CO2 from the air, strip it, and use it to build their branches, their leaves, their structures. And amazing. So even though these ancient Greeks may seem way out there, the more we learn about modern physics and science, they were having profound insights, and it was simply through human reason and observation. So trip on that next time you see a tree. Realize it's primarily made of air, and we as humans have a symbiotic relationship with them. we breathe in what they're basically exhaling or stripping from the CO2, and what we're breathing out is what they use to build themselves. And so we have this interplay between trees, and maybe that's part of my great love for them. Well, I'm over time, so I'm going to start, but join me on Thursday and we'll pick up with the pluralist.